Welcome back to the Student Hub Live, taught postgraduate induction in education and childhood and youth. This marks the first of 4 sessions this afternoon where we're going to take a specific look in a lot more detail into each of the pathways. And the first one that we're going to look at is being a successful leadership and management student at the OU. And to discuss this, I'm joined by Eric and Jane. Thank you for coming along today. So we've seen a lot of students who filled in our widgets earlier were from the leadership and management pathway. And we've asked them 3 words to describe their identity and also about work setting. So what's your work setting? Now, with these word clouds, you've got 3 things that you can put in there. The results won't submit unless you put 3 things in. But if you can't think of 3 things, just put 1 or 2 and put a full stop in the other boxes so that your results can submit. We've also asked you a question where you are leadership and management the same thing? And your answers can be yes, no or unsure. So let us know about that. Right, tell us about the students then. Who applies for the leadership and management pathway?
We get a range of students applying for the leadership and management pathway. Most of them work in sort of an educational setting of some sort. So we'll have students from the school sector, we'll have students from the FE sector, we'll have students from HE, and we'll have students from the non-formal sector as well. So we do often get a broad range of students who are either interested in leadership and management or practicing leaders themselves within the specific context that they're working in.
But besides that, then we get some more, what might, at first glance, seem more surprising applicants and entrants. So, for example, we have students from the army, we have students from the police force, we have students who are working in organisations where they have some kind of training role, which gives them leadership possibilities. For example, working in PR firms. We've had a student, for example, who was working in a beautician's, but leading a group of other beauticians. So I think these ideas about educational leadership and educational management are very broad-ranging and attract a really wide range of students.
Can you say something about the words leadership and management and what that applies to? You've mentioned a beautician, for example. Do people have to be leaders? I mean, it seems very grand, leaders and managers. What sorts of ways might students contextualise that? And do students ever worry, for example, if they are the beautician, saying actually everyone else is in these, jobs with nice suits, etc., doing proper leadership and management type things? How broad do these terms apply, and how do students feel in relation to those terms?
I mean, in terms of the terms, I think what we see leadership as a relational, very, very relational activity that you will be involved in. So, irrespective of the setting that you're working in, it's very easy to exercise leadership, which is mainly around getting people, working with people through a particular process of some sort to bring about change or bring about improvement. So what we expect students to be able to do is to be able to enact that, what we draw on in terms of the theory that we pick on. And although we draw a lot on educational leadership literature, a lot of the issues that we unpack are relevant in many, many, many settings. So whether you are in the army or in a training setting, for instance, a lot of the issues that we pick on in terms of distributed leadership, in terms of transformational leadership, will apply. They will apply. It's just that the setting may be slightly different to what you probably maybe be engaging with in terms of the literature that we'll be using.
And in terms of that what seems sometimes as dichotomy between leadership and management, I mean, I think that is one of the major issues that is explored through the modules, that in some senses leadership and management are seen as a binary, that leadership is about, as Eric was saying, relational in terms of people, and very often management is seen as in relation to, as it were, things, that leadership is about transforming practice and management is often about maintaining practice. In practice, actually, then those terms are much more ambiguous and fluid. And I think that is one of the things, that kind of that exploration and that interrogation of those as binary terms is one of the things that attracts students and is one of the things that interests such a wide range of students onto this pathway.
we asked everyone at home, are leadership and management the same thing? And they've been voting. And if you haven't voted on the word clouds, then do let us know 3 words to describe your identity and also 3 things about your work setting. And remember that if you can't put 3 things in there, then a full stop will suffice so that you can submit your results. So let's see what people said about our leadership and management the same thing. Right, 88% of them said no, 13% said yes, nobody's unsure. I would have said unsure. OK, so the consensus is that they're not the same thing. And I mean, I think, Jane, that really echoes the point that you're making.
No, I think that's right, but I think it's actually, you know, the exploration of the way that those 2 terms can be seen as separate but can overlap, they can meld into each other in certain situations. And I think many of the practical situations that our students who are also working in organisations find themselves is that they'll find themselves affecting both leadership practices and management practices when it comes to the reality of their work.
Excellent. We've asked people about their work setting and people are filling that in at the moment. A lot of people talking about where they're studying in terms of work, or perhaps maybe working from home, kitchen, etc. But also if you are in an applied setting, let us know. So fill in the details on that what's in your work setting widget. Lee and Claudia, how's everything on the hot desk? And are there any questions that people have got right now about the leadership and management pathway?
We've primarily been talking about the differences between leadership and management as well, and it's been that main question really that we've been looking at. Is leadership and management the same thing? And if not, what are the differences? And a lot of our students quite rightly have already identified that they are very different things indeed. And you know, Claudia's even sort of said on the sort of help desk as well, that we've both in fact met many managers that are not also necessarily leaders. So they're very different things, and we've all got our own experiences from workplaces that sort of contribute to that as well.
Yes, and on the side we're also learning Japanese.
All right. Very, very good to multitask. So some people here for our applied linguistics section a little bit later. It's good to see. Excellent. If you have any questions, we're going to start talking about each of the key stages now. But if you do have any questions, now's your chance to let us know. And if you're watching on Catch Up and you do have a question, email us and we'll pass it on studenthub@open.ac.uk, or just pop a question in the chat, remembering that no question is too silly. OK, now, Eric, we began the day talking about these various 3 stages, and people can watch that on the catch-up if they'd like to. But I'd like to talk specifically about the leadership and management pathway and go through each of the stages and leadership and management journey. Actually, Jane, perhaps I should start asking you first, because you're the chair of stage 1, what it is.
No, and that's fine. Yes, so I've been chairing the stage 1 in leadership and management, and that is, well, first of all, it's that general introduction to the topic of leadership and management. It looks at, for example, one of the big topics it looks at is what we call leadership and agency. And I think agency is one of these terms which has become part of the mainstream of professional life, for example, which is how much and to what extent and in what ways people in their workplace and their organisation have agency. In other words, can exercise their own choices and can influence conditions and can influence change and can influence things like professional development. So this idea of agency is something which is, to be agentive in a sense, is to exercise leadership. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you are or have a formal leadership role if you are if you have agency in a situation. So those are not necessarily the same things. I think earlier in the day I was talking about this idea that many of the students who come onto the leadership and management pathway are aspiring leaders rather than leaders with that what is called positional leadership. In other words, something like, you know, in a school a head of department or an assistant head teacher. But these are very often people who are exercising leadership in those more informal ways, either in small teams or in small groups or for specific projects within their workplace organisation, or in situations and circumstances outside their workplace and organisation. So this idea of understanding what leadership and agency is partly to start students on that kind of reflective journey about what they do in terms of exercising leadership and how they exercise leadership. So that's one of the big key topics in stage one. The second of the big key topics is leading professional development, because one of the ways in which, again, in informal or less formal settings in organisations, that students can be involved in leadership is actually leading on change in the people around them. In other words, leading on some kind of professional change, leading on some kind of professional development or professional learning. And that can be quite a short-term thing, but it can be very instructive for them to be thinking about what those characteristics and attributes of leadership are that they apply to that situation when they're in that potentially short-term or fixed-term situation in which they are the person who is, the chair, who is the person who is the team leader, who is the person who is the group organizer. And then one of the last of the big topics that we look at in the stage one module is about leading organizational change. And this can be some of the bigger kind of change situations that occur. Perhaps stereotypically in a school where you can have huge changes that occur, curriculum review or the new years coming in or new pastoral systems being set up. But that kind of endemic deep change and how that affects the whole organisation. So really, part of the journey of the module is starting from small beginnings and then having students by the end of that module really thinking about large-scale change, how it affects them, how it affects leadership, how it affects an organisation.
And can you say anything about the different disciplines and theories that provide frameworks for which you can deal with some of these big topics?
Sure. Do you want to pick up?
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, with regards to that, one of the things we look at is distributed leadership, for instance, because we do believe that we're in a post-heroic era where leadership it's not just situated within just one person, but it's something that has to be distributed within an organization. Allowing others to lead within your organization can easily lead to better school improvement or improvement within whichever setting you're in. So that's one of the key things we look at. But again, as Jane said, one of the key aims of the module is to help you transform your own practice or help transform the practice of others. So we look at issues around transformational leadership, how it's been enacted, what are some of the debates, how it's worked for people and how it hasn't worked for people as well. So these all provide that sort of framework for how we talk about educational leadership at stage one.
And there are also some very topical current debates that you incorporate within some of this theory and framework, for example. We were talking about educational leadership and management and distributed leadership as well. Anything to do with power, culture, those sort of bigger, broader things, do they play a part in this whole dialogue? Yes,
we pick on that particularly at stage two of the pathway. And at stage two, firstly, we start with, again, understanding educational leadership and management, because we get quite a number of students coming through credit transfer, so they may not necessarily have studied the stage one module with us. So we start off with unpacking what leadership and management is, not in the same way, but this time we're looking at educational leadership and management beyond your small team or beyond your own organization, but we're looking at it much broadly. So that's where issues around culture come in, issues around context come in, issues around even role come in terms of the different roles one could have within a leadership arena. So we can have a middle leader, we can have a senior leader. So we begin to unpack some of these roles that we can have and how that impacts on you, the individual who's leading others.
We asked people about identity and describing identity, and I'd like to get the results from that soon. So if you haven't already let us know 3 words that describe your identity, then fill those in on the bottom left-hand side of the screen, and we'll take a look in just a minute. Why is identity so important then, Eric?
It's very, very important because, I mean, as we navigate through our own careers and as we navigate through our own practice, it's very important that we identify ourselves as either a leader or not, because that has, it comes with the roles and responsibilities in terms of what you're expected to do as a leader. So identifying yourself as a leader has a lot of accountability coming with it. So in terms of stage 2, we look at that because one of the key things about stage 2 is that we hope that by the end of the module, students will be able to begin to critically engage with their own practice, but also be able to lead change. So the module is all about exploring strategy and how you lead change. So your identity as a leader plays a key role in terms of how you're able to exercise your leadership on others. So people grow through being a first line leader, manager, into middle leadership, into senior leadership. So as you grow, your identity begins to change. And then as you engage with the literature as well, you begin to see how others have evolved themselves within their own practice based on what has been reported on. So it's very, very important that we're able to unpack that for students.
No, absolutely. But the thing is, I guess leadership and management seem such positive, good, big words. And, you know, I think we'd all like to be good leaders and have everyone follow us. Yeah. But often, you know, when we're asked to describe our identity, often we'll have things that are maybe a little bit more negative. It's very difficult to sort of be as glowing and positive when we take a look at that question. So I'd like to see what everyone at home said. But we have another birthday as well. It's Lisa's birthday. And Lee's having a jammy dodger to celebrate, which I think is very Student Hub Live. So thank you for that. So let's have a look at the Wordle and see what 3 words describe your identity. So we've had student, motivate, control freak, marketing, thinker, logical. Fired up. Student, what an interesting word that's come out there centrally, because so many people say, I'm doing the OU, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, and in fact, this whole idea of student community, etc. How do you see this in terms of people saying, well, I'm a student? Is that more important than being a leader or a manager?
For me, I think it's particularly important. And I think one of the things that, I mean, I've been working at the Open University for about 10 years now. And I think one of the things that is so important to me is that the Open University celebrates roles in a very good way, in a very positive way.
Not sausage rolls. No, we like them too.
No, that's right. Or possibly jam rolls in the case of Lee. But no, I think that idea of roles is that, you know, on a leadership and management Masters in Education degree course, then we will have students who are in very senior and responsible positions in their own organisation. But the fact that they identify themselves as students is the fact that they are embracing that role of studying. And I think, you know, when I am chairing EE811, I am embracing that role of chairing the module. But I have also been an Open University student concurrently. And when I am an Open University student, I embrace the role of being a student. And I think it's this idea, you know, Eric was talking just now about professional identity. And I think one of the things that we explore through a pathway like leadership and management is really interrogating that notion of professional identity. You know, what it is, what are the fixed features and what are those features that are fluid and what are those features that are changing and what are those features that are developing. But I think that idea that you can put the student hat on when you start a master's degree, that you can accept and embrace that role, that you can celebrate that there are things that you're going to get fired up about and that you're going to learn. I think that's part of the excitement.
I wanted to ask, before we move on to stage 2 in more detail, Eric, because you'd started to mention some exciting things there about power, etc., that I'd like to go into. But by the end of the first stage, students are expected to be able to have located and critically engaged with a variety of literature. So again, there are different skills coming into play here. So we've spoken about the theories and the various dimensions and frameworks. Jane, briefly, what skills would you expect students to have developed at the end of the stage, and therefore what might they want to look out for right now as they begin their learning journey?
Well, I think one of the things that we talked about in an earlier session are these online and digital skills, which are so central to the success of their study. I think in terms of their study at postgraduate level, then we use these words like critical analysis and critical reflection. And I think, if I were to generalise about the difference between undergraduate study and postgraduate study, then I think that that at undergraduate level, and this is a generalisation, please, but at undergraduate level, then very often module materials and academic articles are there to support student study. At postgraduate level, we use words like interrogate. So in other words, the student is starting to make that journey into interrogating accepted policy, accepted academic articles, accepted literature, and the very fabric of the module itself. And that's part of their individual journey through the Masters in Education. I think one of the things that we included in what we think are essential materials for study on the MEd is a notebook and a pen. And that's because there is something called a reflective journal, which we encourage students, but it's actually built into the fabric of their study from the first week of the first module. And that is that they actually reflect actively on their own progress. They reflect in terms of their reaction to particular articles, particular module materials that they see, and that they interrogate them. In other words, that critical analysis is about not acceptance, but about questioning as well as reflection.
I want to pick up on this idea of interrogation because I think it's a big word. We did critical thinking this morning. And for all those students who stayed with us this morning, in particular, Lisa, the birthday girl, yes, of course, you're very, very welcome to come to this session. Everyone's welcome at the Student Hub Live, so please do keep chatting. Please do stay with us. And of course, if you've got any questions, do let us know as well. So, Jane, this morning we talked about critical thinking. We were trying to get our heads around that sort of concept. Interrogating sounds a little bit more senior at a level. Can you tell us something about how students might start to think about interrogating some of the stuff that they're going to come across?
Well, I think one of the things, to reassure students is that it's completely structured into the fabric of the first module, of the Stage 1 module. In other words, every week they go through a series of readings, a series of activities, and each of those activities has within it these opportunities for reflection, for critical engagement, structured very often, and certainly at the beginning of the module around questions that they're asked, but where they're asked to question some of the premises of, say, an academic article or a piece of policy or a piece of literature. So, and that questioning, that kind of critical thinking, that critical reflection becomes more and more marked and becomes more and more central to their study as they progress through the module. So it's small steps at the beginning and highly structured steps to the point where in some of the assessment that they're doing from about the midpoint of the course, they are being asked specifically to engage in that in terms of, here's an academic article which is a point of view on leadership, and what we're asking you to do is we're asking you to judge it in a critical way, not simply to accept it, but actually to look at the gaps in it, but actually to look for what it doesn't do, to think about what it hasn't said, and so on.
Which takes us very nicely to Stage 2. And Rachel, who as another birthday girl, has just joined us back. Stay with us, Rachel and Lisa, because at the end of the session, we're going to be talking about, at the end of today's programme at 4:30, we're going to be talking about the importance of community and using social media as well. So do stay tuned. Right, Eric, Stage 2. You say that one of the principles for the qualification is to stimulate critical analysis, debate and reflection, and not to provide cut and dried solutions. So this whole idea of interrogating and things becomes even more vital at Stage 2.
At Stage 2, yes. At Stage 2, we're hoping that they've had that initial introduction at Stage 1. And even if they haven't, they're probably credit transferring, which means they've engaged with postgraduate study at least at 60 credits from elsewhere.
Yep.
So the expectation is that they're coming in with some knowledge. So at Stage 2, we kind of revamp it a bit to make sure that students are critically engaged and not just describing what they've seen or what they've read. But a key fundamental bit of the leadership and management pathway at Stage 2 is exploring strategy. One of the key things here is that at stage 1, they would have been introduced to leadership of a small group of people or a small team. At stage 2, we're looking at organizational level leadership or even beyond your own organization. And that's why I said one of the key things we look at is exploring strategy. And to be able to do that, we look at issues around conflict. Then how do you navigate that? And what does the literature say around that? So we're looking at issues around moral leadership. How is that enacted? What does the literature say about moral leadership? We're looking at democratic leadership. What is that? And what does the literature say? Because again, that's one of the key facets that we would want to more or less promote within leadership. But then we need to interrogate that and understand what people have written about and how that manifests into your own practice.
Now, writing about things in literature, I'm assuming you're not meaning some of these management books that say there's a right way to do it and this is how you be a great leader. You take a very, very different approach so that you see leadership as relational, dynamic and very much context-bound as opposed to other approaches that view it as a formula. Exactly,
and that's one of the key things that we say along all the way from stage 1 all through. And that's one of the reasons why at stage 2 and stage 3, you begin to do some empirical study yourself. Because one of the key things we don't want to do is to say this is how it's done. Because again, as I said earlier, context matters. It's very, very important to understand that the context within where leadership is enacted does really matter and impacts on how leadership is exercised. The different roles that you may find yourself in actually has influence on the way you can actually enact your leadership. And the model that you'll be working in some cases, you'll be working in a matrix model of leadership, for instance, where you probably maybe have to do things and work with people. It's a relational activity, work with people that you may not necessarily manage. So it comes back to the issue, the difference between leading and managing, because you sometimes find yourself in an organizational setting where you're leading lots of projects or you're leading groups of people that you don't directly sort of manage. So getting to understand and unpack some of these things is very, very important for the different types of students that we encounter. In particular, when you've got these other things going on that may be outside your leadership control, like centralisation, decentralisation, all these sort of peaks and flows. I want to cover section 3, but before I do, just tell us something about moral leadership, because I think this is a really, really important issue and something that perhaps is difficult to teach. Yes, and we draw a lot on social justice. And how that relates to what we are more or less describing as moral leadership, doing the right thing. And we draw on a lot of literature on social justice, which is around equality of opportunity. And by so doing, it helps us sort of provide that framework or model to look at or interrogate the literature to ensure that whatever you're doing can be perceived as moral, in the sense that we want it to whatever you're doing to be for all. You have to be equitable. You have to ensure that you're equally treating everyone that is within that leadership activity that you're enacting. I'm sure that's prompted a lot of discussion about leadership and in particular some of the key leaders we see in the news and their morality. We'll come to the hot desk in just one second and then we'll talk about stage 3, which is the dissertation. But Jane, before I do that, let's just take a quick trip to Lee and Claudia.
Yeah, lots of sort of conversation amongst students looking at issues in leadership and management. Vincent's made some interesting points as well, and has made a point recently about sort of democracy and how that ties in with leadership as well. There's so many interesting themes around that he's looking into. He's currently typing another message on that now, so yeah, absolutely. There's more coming on that one, but otherwise there's the birthdays that we mentioned out there, and lots of just interesting discussion really about OU studies.
Right, we're nearly out of time, Jane, and we need to cover this dissertation, which is the stage 3 that you mentioned earlier. Now, with every dissertation comes a research question. So tell us what happens in this last stage.
Well, what happens is, and you know, besides all of the leadership content focus that Eric was talking about, then another thing that is covered in the stage 2 module is the development of research skills. I mean, we call them research skills, but actually it's like a practical inquiry, which is the focus of the dissertation at stage 3. And so the practical inquiry is focused on the student's own context. In general, that will be the student's own workplace organisation. And a practically focused question about the leadership of professional change, about the leadership of other adults within an organisation, but it is around a particular topic. And I mean, we found, for example, in our Stage 3 dissertation module students so far, that it tends to be something which is very much at the heart of what they themselves have wanted to do, sometimes for a long time. And in many cases, this master's degree has given them the opportunity to be able to do it. And very often and very happily with the support of their organisation. So that, you know, a particular change practice which is something that the student has wanted to do or that the organisation itself wants to effect is something that they take as the practical focus of their inquiry. So I'm emphasising the practical focus because it is also a proper piece of research, so that the students have been developing all of these research skills. They have been looking at paradigms, you know, all of these words that we talk about when we talk about research, conceptual underpinnings, particular research design, particular research frameworks, particular data gathering methods that they would use, so that it is taken completely seriously as a piece of research, and it results in a piece of what we call empirical research, which is, in other words, is practical data gathering, for example, through interviews, through focus groups, through questionnaires, and then data analysis, and then a dissertation which ends in conclusions and recommendations.
Excellent. But just to add that, it's very, very important that it's small scale. Yeah. It's very, very important that it's kind of discrete within your own organizational setting, because you have to have a bit of control over that, because you've only got a set number of weeks to complete that. And you have we advise that students sort of bear all that in mind. And one of the key things is to make sure, because it's an applied degree, we want them to always remember that it has to involve critical reflection. Yeah. Very, very, very crucial, because the whole idea is it's an applied degree.
Absolutely. And I know from my own experience, it's often better to get a very tight project that you can manage and you've got more control over, because once you've got that qualification, you can then go off and do so much more. It's not the end, is it? Well, thank you very much, Eric and Jane, for coming along. And if you've joined us recently or you're watching this on Catch Up, then do look at our earlier videos where we talked about what it means to be a successful student and a little bit about some of the tips and advice that we recommend, including things like time management and critical thinking in the earlier programme from today. We're going to have a short video and look at one of the Bob videos, which is from the OU Library. So if you haven't already located the library, do find that from your Student Home website and take a look there. But this is about avoiding plagiarism. We'll be back then to take a look at what we mean by inclusion in a few minutes. See you then.